Hello.
Hello, hello.
Hello.
Can you hear us okay, Jonathan?
Yes, very well.
Brilliant, brilliant. I think there'll be more people joining through Zoom today because it's our sort of like half term at college. But thank you so much for agreeing to do this. We absolutely appreciate it, and it's amazing that you're sparing your time to talk with us.
My pleasure.
So we spoke with one of your colleagues the other week, John Vervaeke, and so he expressed that he holds you in very high regard and thinks, he said to us, your thinking is delicious. So one of the things that I really appreciate about what you've brought to, say, the public discourse is this idea, this approach to religion and mythology is something that is symbolic, and as part of your symbolic world. I was wondering, why do you think that has been so effective as an approach to religion?
Well, I think one of the issues that people have dealt with, let's say in the 19th, 20th century, is that because many religious groups have tried to defend their faith based on, let's say, scientific methods or accepting scientific presupposition, one of the things it did is that it in some ways made faith or religion arbitrary. It's like, well, here are a bunch of things that you have to believe, so you believe in the material world and all these scientific causalities being the only type of structure you can describe. And then on top of that, you add something like, so God came into the world and then died on a cross, and now he went to heaven, and if you believe, I mean, what are you talking about? This is absolutely ridiculous thing to say. If you just take on this like materialist type structure, but if you believe in that the world is actually, let's say, dependent on meaning and attention, and that attention actually, let's say, at least participates in the way the world reveals itself to us. And so it means then that the mechanisms of attention, which is something like stories, images, the way that we compress facts together into stories, are part of the way, or not just part, but they are in some ways the source of how reality unfolds. And so then you can start to talk about narrative and about ritual and about images, and it makes sense to people because you're coming at it from a different tack. You're coming at it from the question of meaning, which I think that if you talk to John Vervaeke, you've noticed that meaning is inevitable. You can't avoid the question of relevance, and you can't avoid the question of telos and purposes. Like, we see things through purposes and through relevance. And so I think that in that frame, then I can show how. So one of the problems too that's happened with religious thinkers is that on the one hand, you had religious thinkers that said something like, let's say in the more conservative side, the Bible doesn't mean anything. It's just a description of things that happen. So if you try to look for meaning in it, it's almost as if you're destroying the factuality of it. You're destroying the fact that it happened. Because we're scientists, we believe the world is arbitrary. We think things happen arbitrarily. There is no pattern. These deep patterns don't exist. And on the other hand, you had the same, on this, like, let's say the opposite of it, you had religious thinkers that said, oh, look at all these patterns. None of this must have happened because all of these look like mythological stories. They have rhymes and their structure, they have chiasms, they have all these structures in them. And so it's like, because we believe the world manifests itself arbitrarily, therefore, all of this is just a bunch of stuff people made up, a bunch of stories people made up. And so what I'm trying to propose is saying, no, the world actually manifests itself through patterns. And so you have to have a pattern in order to even perceive the world. And so the things religion deal with are real. They deal actually with events that happen, but they just don't describe them the way you would like them to. They describe them in a way that reveals their meaning, is the way to say that. And so because of that, I feel like I've been able to kind of bridge a little bit, let's say, Christian and secular worlds, and I've helped more conservative Christians to realize, you can't. The tack that they've been taking is nonsense, and I think I've helped secular people say, oh, okay, this is what this stuff is about. It's and also all these things help you understand religious phenomena in different ways. I don't know if that answers your question.
That's a brilliant answer. Thank you very much. And I'd invite anyone here to ask questions, even on Zoom. Maybe if you could type them in the chat, that'd be great.
Yeah, just on this, on when you talk about mythology, one conversation you and I have is, does it matter that all of it happened? Because that was the conversation. Did it happen? Did it not happen? And now, because of Jordan Peterson, Christianity's got a good hold because of its talk about mythology and archetypes. But
Yeah.
the question, does it matter that it actually happened?
So I think that, how can I say this? I think that all religions are based on events, and even when the ancient myths describe the gods, they're talking about events. They're not talking about events at the same level that we're talking at, right? And so there are different levels of events, and it's very simple. Like when I describe the tying of my shoe, it's not the same level of event that if I say Rome fell. Like the category of Rome fell is an extremely high event in terms of what it implies, and then people could even argue about it because it's so big. So imagine if you take that even bigger. When they describe the gods, I think they're describing events, just very, very high events, or almost very abstract events. Maybe the best way to understand it. But for sure, let's say, one of the things that happens in time, and you see that in the Bible, and you see that in the Old Testament and the New Testament, is that there's a way in which people realize that there's a concretization of those patterns. It's like these patterns actually happen in the world. They're not just high patterns, that actually the world that we live in is actually patterned in those same way. So for sure, in terms of Christianity, I think to be a Christian, you have to believe in the incarnation and the death and resurrection of Christ, and that those are events that happen in the world. Now, I've said many times, they're not forensic descriptions, and they're not trying to describe the causalities of what's happening. They're not trying to describe the nature of the resurrected body of Jesus. You don't see any of that. They actually tried to obfuscate the capacity to simply see the resurrection as some kind of let's say forensic event that you could describe to a police officer, because there's actually moments when the disciples don't recognize Jesus. They don't know what they're looking at. They don't know what's going on. And so there's a sense in which the Bible itself is saying, yes, the resurrection happened, but don't try to box it in. Like, don't try to give it a forensic description. But I think it's important to understand that, because one of the problems of wanting things to be symbolic or only mythological or only archetypal is that then you again have the same issue, which is that you believe that the world doesn't actually exist in those archetypes, that somehow the world can exist just neutrally and arbitrarily. But I think what we're discovering more and more is that your very capacity to perceive the world is imbibed in those mechanisms. So your very capacity to link events together in order to see unity in multiplicity of events is necessarily archetypal. So you could say something like, there's nothing that happens which isn't to some degree archetypal, or that if we're not able to see the archetypal aspect of what's happening, it's a fault of ours. And that something like the saints, the enlightened ones, could see the pattern in everything, right? They could notice that the entire world is a theophany of these primordial patterns. So I think it's important. It's an important distinction, because I get a lot of that, obviously, because I talk about symbolism. People, they want to stay up in the symbols and they're interested in seeing the patterns. But it's how it lands that's really important, I think. And that's what makes a difference in terms of a way to live and a way to embody these patterns. It's not just something we think about, right? It's not just something we read in books. It's not just when we interpret movies. It's that, let's say, if a movie is a condensed, very, very compressed story of someone's love life, let's say a love movie, your story of your love life will follow similar patterns, right? The difference between a story is just that they compress. It's like you take all the salient facts, you distill them into more salient facts, and then you compress them together. So you take your love story of your life, let's say, and then you remove the bits where you're going to the bathroom and where you're doing something else and you're working. You take out all the bits that don't relate to the pattern, and then you just smash them together. And that's why when we watch movies or we read books, like let's say novels, we have revelation, because it's like I'm connecting all these things much closer together, and then it can reflect back on me. But those patterns exist in your life. That's why we care about them. That's why we find them interesting, is because they're reflecting something which exists in the world.
Do you think the same thing is true with something like music? In that music is a layered sort of set of patterns. So I think this is something that Jordan Peterson talks about quite a lot, and really sort of emphatically, this idea that music sort of embodies this harmony that people should live in.
I think so. I think that for music, it's harder to talk about because music seems to be much more abstract in terms of the relations between let's say the things that it posits. And so the patterns are almost, in some ways, they're more immediate because they're almost pure. They're just basically, so you have experiences of, let's say, of relationships between sounds. That's what you're experiencing. So there has to be a beginning, there has to be an end, and then there has to be some kind of movement. Of course, a lot of contemporary composers have tried to smash that or break that as much as possible. But even in breaking it, they're always calling back. It's like, I'm breaking this, like I'm breaking this thing that will call and will create tension and opposites and longing for resolution of the pattern. And then you can tease someone with music by not resolving the pattern, and then finally giving your resolution, which is different from the one you expected. So there's all these things you can do to play with. But I think that's exactly what's going on in music. So you have different joys that you experience in music. Some of them are really more like a roundabout, like a round where you have one melody that repeats, and then you know what to expect, and it's almost like it can also become trance-like, where you just keep repeating the same melody over and over. You find also a comfort, let's say lullabies, all these things that our parents used to sing to us, or church songs, or whatever, things that find comfort. Then you have more, let's say, if you have more complex pleasures that you can experience in terms of pattern, where there is more like a novel, right? It's like, I've set you up, and then you think I'm going that way, and then I take you this way, and then finally I resolve it in a way that you didn't expect. So yeah, that's what but I'm not an expert on music, but I think that's definitely true about music too.
Brilliant. I'd love to dive into some of your thoughts about contemporary art and music. But before we do, Stephen Chan in the chat has asked, some of what has been described reminds me of fractals with nature. What is the relationship between archetypal patterns and fractals? Are they two of the same, or is there some differentiation?
I think the best way to understand symbolic patterns is fractals. That's for sure. If people are interested in that, my brother wrote a book called The Language of Creation, which goes more into it in almost like a mathematical way. But that is really the way to understand order. And what fractals do in terms of symbolism is that in some ways you basically have one pattern, which is like one and many. Like that's the pattern. It's like one and many, and usually it's almost like one and two. So it's like unity, opposition, and then resolution of opposition. Sometimes it can become more complex, but usually that's just the basic pattern. And it can be represented in all kinds of ways, as a mountain, as all these different types of patterns. But the idea that it's fractal is very important, which means that because you can experience the pattern at every level, you can experience unity. So let's say it this way: you can experience unity and multiplicity at, let's take the relationship between people and groups and things. You can experience it within yourself. We have a multiplicity of thoughts and passions and ideas, but you're somehow able to notice that you're one person. And then you can do that in a group, in a family. So it's like there's multiple people in the family, but we recognize unity within that family. Then you can scale that up into groups, into churches or religious groups or cities, nations, et cetera, et cetera. You can just keep scaling that up until you realize that you know the idea that, for example, the United States is one thing. It's like, why is it one thing? It's like billions and billions of things, but it's true through that fractal relationship. And one of the things that modernism has done is that we do want to get into modernism, is that modernism has tended to level the fractal nature of things. It tends to want to either stay in opposites, kind of irreducible opposites, often wants to reduce it into like a basic opposite where you don't have this self-same fractal structure. And so because of that, it tends to, so a good example would be, the way that traditional societies are usually set up or have this fractal nature, right? So a medieval village has the home with the hearth, and then those homes in the hearth exist in neighborhoods with churches, and then all those neighborhoods with churches exist in like a bigger city with the cathedral. The cathedral is the highest building, and then it's like the center for the entire city, and then now that reproduces itself all the way down. And so what modernism tends to do is that it like levels. It doesn't tend to want to understand the fractal nature, and so it'll create things like suburbs and let's say shopping centers, and then there's no centers, and the houses become decentered. We don't even think about the manner in which the house, the family would come together properly in a house. It's just like living spaces basically that are just kind of leveled. So modernity tends to do that. It tends to move towards absolute uniformity, and then also idiosyncratic multiplicity. So, and if you look at most modern movements, you'll notice that they tend to swing between those two extremes. And so you can have something like, let's say in painting, you can have something like supremacism and expressionism happening at the same time. You have these movements towards abstraction where we want to reduce, if you think of Malevich's painting, for example, you want to reduce everything to its absolute essence, like color field painting, even all the way into the 70s, or conceptual art. And then you have, absolute breakdown where it's like anything goes, there are no rules, it's just complete idiosyncrasy. You tape a banana to a wall and that's considered equal to any form of art. So that's definitely what I think happens. I don't know modernism as much in music, so sadly, but I do see something about, for example, atonal music in the 20th century, that it has that tendency. It's like it doesn't take it into account the fractal nature of how we experience music, and so you have this like imposition of mathematical structures that are extremely complex onto a musical system that doesn't take into account the human desire for something like a simple round, like a simple return, or a simple cycle of coherent experience. And so it's, I don't think that modern music or modern art is, how can I say this, that it's stupid, or that it's, a lot of people have this idea that it's just anything goes. No, it's not true. It's not anything goes. It actually tends to be extremely, like, almost tyrannical imposition of like systems of thinking onto the art. And then you end up with things that people actually, or that very few people can enjoy, because it's so high that it's almost impossible for it to land.
Beautifully articulate. Taiwi Roberts, who can't be here today, has asked, you've discussed before your view on contemporary art as an odd fetishization of the art object removed from any actual function. Could you say more about that, and especially whether you think that contemporary music has arrived at a similar place? There's much crossover between these two worlds, and I wonder if music might have also been removed too far from having a functional context. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how music has evolved in the modern era. And he says, thank you so much for your work and best wishes.
No, I totally think that the same thing happened to music that happened to all the other arts, is that if you think about in the medieval world, people struggle to understand this, and they think that it's actually like a diminishing of art. But in the medieval world, poetry and music would always serve a function, which is why, for example, poetry would be panegyric. Most poetry in the medieval times would be panegyric, would be something like celebrating something, like celebrating a king, celebrating a saint, celebrating Christ and everything. And we tend to think like that's lower, but it's actually because it was trying to serve a purpose in the world. And music, I think, would have been the same, That is, most music would have been either, let's say, folk music in terms of dancing, so it has a communal function. It would have been composed for certain events, for certain high figures like kings and nobles or whatever, to celebrate certain accomplishments, often related to poetry as well. So let's say someone would compose a ballad to celebrate a great feat that would have happened in a battle. And then you can see, of course, that the highest version of that would be celebrating God. And so the highest forms of music would be directed towards the church and directed towards celebration of God. And I think that even as secular people, I think it's probably possible to kind of understand why that is. It's just saying we want the music to be integrated into everything else. We don't want it to stand out as just a strange, like, idiosyncratic thing, but rather we want it to integrate with other things, and therefore it has to participate in the world. And especially the church would have been a manner in which it participated in society at the highest level, celebrating the highest thing, but then also would have been in relationship to the poetry, in relationship to the images as well, in the space, let's say, in a kind of sacred space. So architecture, music, all these things would have come together into a kind of celebration. So what we see with the modern music is, first of all, already with the opera, we have a problem, which is that we have a problem because in some ways we're moving towards, like, let's say, entertainment. Now, there's nothing wrong with entertainment. I think entertainment's fine, but I don't think that that's the highest function that music can play. But it sadly, that is pretty much now today what it has been relegated to. And I think that already starts at the moment with the celebration of opera as being supposedly the highest art. And you see the same with dance. It's like, ballet becomes the highest dance. Well, it's like, yeah, I don't know. Wouldn't the highest dance be more integrated? Like folk dancing or court dancing would have been more integrated into the world than ballet, because ballet is just spectator. And so I think that concert music already brings music into a space where it's going to reach high. So it's like, this is the thing. When I talk about this separation of, like, absolute, let's say, a kind of tyranny and then a kind of idiosyncrasy. So it's going to bring highs. And so I totally agree that Bach and Mozart, and maybe Beethoven reach highs that liturgical music didn't. Because it kind of abstracts itself and it moves away from its ground, like the way that it's incarnated into the world. But I think already when you get to Beethoven, you're like in deep, you're seeing the trouble, like, right out the door, like you're just seeing the trouble coming. And I think that trouble starts to unravel rather quickly. And so then you end up with composers that are so obscure in terms of popular capacity to listen. Like, if nobody listens to Webern that doesn't study art, like nobody listens to all these modern composers. And then what happens is the music that becomes popular becomes more and more, let's say, trite, and more almost like all in the hips, right? It just kind of moves down into the hips, which was there in the Middle Ages. Like, there was dance was part of it, but there was something kind of holding it together. But now it moves just into the hips, and then it's like basically, whatever electronic dance music is the end of that. It's like, it's just a beat, basically. It's just a beat. Pop music, it's like these same, especially now, these like new AI, they sound like AI I think they've been using AI for a while, because you have these like melody tropes, and then you're listening to a song, you're like, what the hell? Like, I just heard that, and then people kind of, they pull out certain tropes from each other's songs, and then all the songs just end up sounding exactly the same. It's very weird. So I think that the deincarnation of music has led both to its moving towards something completely obscure and that nobody cares about except for people that study music, and then coming all the way down. The one that's the most incarnate in some ways, I think jazz was the most incarnate because because it stayed with dance. I think it was still the best. The best of what the modern world had to offer was jazz. But even that gets like, it's like, yeah, I don't know. It's like I think I like listening to Miles Davis, but then I don't. It's like I just like I'm just like, what am I listening to? Like I can handle 10 minutes and then I'm done, you know.
Shanuka, you wanted to ask me?
Yeah, just coming back to the question of liturgical music.
Yeah.
There's still lots of texts where no compositions have been written yet for the liturgy. And as new composers are taking it on in this day and age, what advice would you give to them to write for liturgy?
Yeah, it's rough because I'm not like I don't think I know enough about music. I think I would say one of the tropes that I see happening, you know, because in the Orthodox Church right now there is a kind of renewal or desire to renew. And I'm from the Orthodox tradition, so there are some musicians, composers, even in the United States. Benedict Sheehan, who actually was nominated for 2 Grammys, his recent Vespers composition is an attempt to try to create something that is both fully liturgical in the best sense, but then also takes into account some modern development, let's say, puts it to the service of the liturgy without blowing it up, right? And so in some ways offering something also that is accessible to people. I know a big fashion, let's say in the Orthodox Church right now, is to use melodies that can be sung by the congregation, because even in the Catholic Church and in the Orthodox Church, as the modern world kind of became more and more present, what happened is the music became more and more difficult and more professional, and so because of that, it also at some point going to church became a show. So we have that now too on the other end, which is like the evangelical churches that just kind of like make up new songs every 2 weeks, and then nobody knows them, and then they just like sing these songs, and they're all pretty much the same anyways in terms of like their melody structure and stuff. So I would say look at some of the people there. Vladimir Morozan is one of the people right now that I know in the Orthodox Church who's working on that. And then Benedict Sheehan. Those are the 2 in the US, I think, that are at least the most effective.
So I was thinking, I haven't fully fleshed out this question in my head, so I'm sorry if it's going to be confusing, but a common theme of your sort of criticism of modernity and also of recent artistic development is a sort of disregard for meaning and for pattern, right? So
well, there's both. There's actually like a hyper pattern, you could say, a pattern that is so abstract that it almost no one cares about it. Because a lot of the modern, and then there's the opposite. Then there is also like anything goes, whatever you can do. So both these seem to happen at the same time.
Okay. So what I was thinking was sometimes when, let's say, a person whose outlook of the world, maybe a Christian, that sees meaning and pattern in the world as something objective that exists and that reveals a truth that is there independent of me. A conversation between this person and a person who is a complete relativist, for example, and doesn't believe in any meaning or any pattern. Usually what I find when I have those conversations is the person that doesn't believe in any sort of pattern feels very much restrained when they are sort of pushed to believe in a pattern. But if they don't, they have to disregard, for example, human nature, because human nature is a form of a pattern, right?
Yeah.
So
no, they're stuck. You know, I totally agree. I agree with your sentiment. That is that you can see it like in the modern world. This desire to free ourselves from the pattern has led to things that are so abhorrent and absurd that, for a good example would be, let's say deconstructive architecture in the 1980s and 90s. And so, architects would create buildings with like just a massive hole in the living room. It's like, okay, there actually are patterns. You cannot live in a house that has like a 10-foot hole in the living room, because it's just not going to happen, right? So it actually, it's as if some of the experimental music, in some ways, it actually reveals the pattern. And so it's like you can make an effort and listen to like, it's a minimalist acoustic music, and listen to, someone like grading the side of a counter for an hour. Like, you can do it. It's not impossible to do it, but it's like, it actually reveals just how difficult it is to get there. And so we have, for example, like for someone who doesn't think we have patterns, like we have a certain frequency of sound that we're able to hear. It's very simple. We have a certain level of decibel of volume that we're able, or that we can sustain hearing, that we're able to hear and that we can sustain hearing. Those are patterns you cannot avoid these patterns. Like you could destroy someone's hearing if you don't pay attention to these patterns. And then there is a certain level of variation which people find pleasant. And those are probably they're probably derived from the human voice. They're probably derived from our thousands and thousands, millions of years of hearing human intonation and hearing the space that exists in our intonations. And so they're derivations and probably concentrations and derivations of the possible tonalities in the human voice. And so I don't see how even the most secular person could think that that's absurd. It's like these are just kind of like natural, and you could say something like there are certain birds that make certain sounds, and if the male bird makes certain sounds to attract the female, and if they're off, they won't reproduce themselves. And I think that that's true about music. Like, I think that there's a certain, like, yeah, of course there's a musician getting laid or whatever, but that's not what I mean. But I mean is that there's also, like, what I mean is that just that if certain sounds don't continue, let's say there's a certain perseverance of sonority and distance between sounds, then those will become one-off experiments and then they'll go away. Whereas some things will just continue. The things that continue is because we like them and we care about them and we want to kind of perpetuate them. So I think that even like from almost like a Darwinian perspective, you can argue for patterns.
So can I do a follow-up?
Of course, yeah.
Sorry. Basically, what I get from that is that we all live, whether we believe in patterns and meaning or not, we all live as if they exist. We just can't escape it. So they exist and we live according to them. But in this sort of conversation that I was talking about, the person that doesn't believe in them, or rather, the person lives as if they exist, but feels restricted when they have to accept the truth that comes with those meanings and those patterns. So I wonder if you could talk about the relationship between, or the necessary relationship between truth and objectivity and these patterns and these meanings.
Well, it's pride, and I think it's like, if you want to understand all the source of sin, you could say, right, in the world, that's what it is. It's saying there are patterns that have authority over me, and I don't care, like, either you just can't get away from it, right? You can't eat rocks, there are a bunch of things that you cannot do. There are some patterns that have authority over you, and you exist within that's the scope of those patterns. So that exists both objectively even in the natural world, but it also exists in the human world. Like we necessarily have people that are authorities. We have our parents that had to guide us. We have different structures of authority. And so I think that there's it's just pride. It's like, that's why we see that as the root of sin. It's like the idea of self-causation. It's the idea that I can cause myself, right? I can completely contain myself. I can be free from any type of constraint. And, you know, there was a moment, I think, like there was a moment maybe in the late 19th and early 20th century where people could credibly believe that. I really don't see how anybody can believe that anymore. Because one of the things that happens too, which is hilarious, because like in the early 20th century, really, I mean, I can have sympathy for them. Like I have sympathy for the artists in the early 20th century. They're like, we've got this, we're going to do this. But then whatever happened between like, let's say 1900 and maybe 1925, maybe, I don't know in music, but in art and visual art, it's like, then that set up a new way of doing that nobody has changed. It's like experimental music or experimental art is no different now than it was in like 1920. It's like the Dada artists did everything anybody can do now. It's like not explicitly everything, but every idea that any contemporary artist has, you know, installations or whatever, or breaking these rules or whatever, or art that doesn't last long, you know, that it's like all of this happened in 1920. And so what happened is like even the counterculture, like even the people that wanted to like break all the patterns which rule over us, created a kind of weird anti-pattern that now people just follow. It's like ridiculous. And so, you know, it's like who's more conforming, someone who goes to church or a punk rocker? I'm not sure which one is more conforming. Like they both have uniforms, they both you can recognize them, you can, you know, it's just that one is like a kind of anti-pattern, but it's still a pattern. And so I think that's what happens. It's like, that's what happens with a lot of the contemporary, or the idea of not wanting a pattern, is that what you end up is you create an anti-pattern, which is still a pattern, and you can recognize it, right? You can tell. It's like, yeah, you're just doing it upside down, dude. That's all you're doing. Because you turn something upside down doesn't mean that I can't still recognize it. It's still recognize it.
This sentiment echoes a lot of some of the things we were talking about with Samuel Andreyev, who is another guest on Jordan Peterson's podcast. He was saying to us that as a professor of composition, he, in his students' work, he can't see any sort of innovation, something that's necessarily new compared to what's happened in, say, the last 50 or so years of contemporary classical music. And he said to us that he thinks that the contemporary music world, and I wonder if this is true about the contemporary art world too, is in a period of consolidation rather than innovation. And just on top of that, is there a way that we can get back to looking at something like beauty as something that is objective? You mentioned there's a sort of Darwinian sense to that pattern. Is there something biological that we can ground beauty in so that we can get back to this sort of sense of consolidating the arts?
I think so. I definitely think so. And I think that there are certain, I think now we're in a good position in terms of beauty, because we have people, let's say people like Christopher Alexander, for example, or what we call the new urbanist movement. You know, these are credible. And so what they're saying is these fractal relationships are necessary. And so if you can't make a building in any way, there are actual forms that you inhabit a space. So it's like if you inhabit a certain space, you will be prone to do certain things in that space. And you can't make a person a blank slate. It's like if you have a dark crypt-like place, you know, it's not the same as a grand staircase going up into a two-story building. It's like these two things, you're not going to be the same person in one space or the other. And so design now, I think it's almost like a scientific approach to design is bringing back the idea of beauty. And it's breaking down. So if you think of Bauhaus, for example, I'm sorry, I'm just in architecture right now in my mind, but if you think of Bauhaus, for example, and brutalist architecture, you know, they were thinking that they were going to be practical and it was all going to be scientific and everything. But it turns out they're not. It turns out the imposition of like uniformity in the world actually kills the human spirit. Like it really destroys. Living in Bauhaus buildings will destroy you. And so right now, I think that people are kind of waking up and think, oh no, actually these spaces, like they relate to something that we exist in. And so I think we're in a good place, honestly, in some ways. I don't know in terms of music though, but for sure I know that it's going to start. I think that the fact that it starts with architecture and city planning is probably inevitable, because that's the space in which we live. And so if we can see if we can see movements like the New Urbanist movement and these rediscovery of neighborhoods, rediscovery of city centers. So there are several projects in the United States like that, very interesting projects. Then I think that we're going to slowly see other arts follow. And so in my own world, let's say in the world of church, of iconography, what I'm seeing is that the top iconographers in America are actually issued from contemporary art. They're actually issued from the academy, right? They're not just like improvised mom and pop people making icons. They're people who studied in New York, studied in the big schools, and then finally decided to move towards incarnate, let's say art at the service of the community. And so I think that we're in a good position, and people like John Vervaeke, for example, and his idea of relevance and these questions like these types of categories. And you think of Ian McGilchrist as well, and his vision of how the brain works and how perception works. All these thinkers, I think, are opening up the possibility of really saying. So it's like beauty is not one thing. Beauty it's a pattern, right? And so there's a flexibility. It's like a poem. There's a form, but there's also a kind of improvisation. So that's what beauty always manifests itself as. It's like there's a pattern, and then there's a spice, like an improvisation part to it. If we can find the right balance between those two, that's when we knock it out. That's when we hit it. So.
Before we come on to the question, I just want to just point out in something like the study of I can't remember what the name is, the study of animal behavior. Basically, there's this idea of fixed action patterns, which are something that is sort of naturally selected for that animals, will inhabit if how do you say, because of their evolutionary history. So, for example, like on seagulls, you have these little red dots on the beaks that the baby seagull pecks to get the food out of the mother's mouth. I would expect something like beauty as a pattern, as you describe it, in a Darwinian sense, to be something that's built into our biology. Is that?
No, you're right. That it would deeply connect to the way that we're made, and so that's why. And I mean, we have plenty of examples. The old world is just full of examples. Just go to a medieval village in Europe. Just go to a very old city. Just walk around, and then you'll understand what it is that's going on. There's a clear pattern, but there's also a kind of whimsiness through the pattern, and also an adaptivity. So it's like one of the things I think humans find beautiful is the adaptation of the pattern to a particular is the best way to understand it. It's like it's not just a pattern, and so it's like, how does the church fit in that landscape? Like what's the relationship between the city hall and the church? Like if you go to London, for example, and you stand there and you see the parliament and you see the church, and it's like these relationships of things that we know what they are, but how they come together and how they're related, and how one is, how you have this building next to the river and you have a bridge. And so it's like, I think that's what beauty is. It's like this interrelation of patterns to their particular. And so that seems to be exactly how I think that's how evolutionary selection works too, right? It's like if it's properly adapted, then it gets selected, and then it gets moved up. And it's not like we're going to reproduce London in another city, but it's rather that we see how it's properly selected, and those relationships, they kind of inhabit us in a way.
Brilliant. Juanita, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, okay, yeah. Hi, Jonathan, it's a pleasure to have you with us. I have sort of a three-part question. Sorry to bring us back to modernism. My first part of the question is, do you think modernism is inevitable? And the second part, you sort of already touched on when you talked about beauty, and you also talked a little bit more, I feel, on the criticism and detriments of modernism, but I would like you to talk more about what you think is productive within it. And the third part of the question is, what do you think is coming next if we continue the way we're headed?
And get me in like apocalyptic mode here. It's not good. It's not good for you. All right. So yes, I do think modernism is inevitable. I think the best way to understand it's always there. So that's the problem, is like it's a fractal pattern. So what modernism has always been there, let's say, but as a spice or as an excess or as a movement towards something which is a little too much. So that's how I think that's kind of how tradition works. So there's cycles like that. So for example, if you listen to 13th century, high music in France, I mean, it is wild. It is wild. It's like the mathematical patterns are extremely complex. There's rhythmic, there are like different rhythms. And when you listen to it, it's almost like it's so difficult to listen to, because you have like text, you have someone singing melodies and then other people singing, and there seems to be no relation, but there's like this strange mathematical relationship between the different voices. And it's like, but then so what I mean is that these things happen, and at some point it kind of, let's say it breaks, and then it feeds into a more embodied world. And it's always kind of there. There's going to be a little bit of that experimentation. I always kind of think of, if you look at church architecture, again, like Middle Age church architecture. So you'd have the saints, and you'd have, the biblical images, and then in the fringes, in the margins, then you'd have all the crazy stuff. Like you'd have like lewd images and, monsters and things eating their own tails, and like just all this there's kind of experimental space which was held in the margin. And so the same with manuscripts, for example. So you had the main image in the center, and then you had an experimental space in the border where you could go wild, like do all whatever it is, like, knights fighting snails, or scatological imagery, all kinds of stuff that is usually not explored in everyday life. So I think that what modernism did is it basically took that and just like put it out there. It's like, that's what the world is about now. It's kind of about the extremes. And so in some ways, I do think that in big cycles, we'll come to moments where these extremes will manifest themselves. We saw the same happening in the late Roman Empire, for example, or like, let's say the late Roman Republic and early Roman, like at that transition, there were some really wild things. Like there were mosaics that they would make mosaics of crumbs. And so they would make like a mosaic where it looked like someone had eaten the day before and had left crumbs on the table. And like that was their decorative element. And so they would have like images of, like decomposed things. And there was this experimental space that was opening up that was becoming really, really intense. And I think that you could even argue that Ovid's Metamorphosis is a very modern text, and that's why Augustus hated it so much. It's like he hated Ovid. He's like just talking about sex all the time, and then talking about, so it's like these moments have happened before, so I think so. So what is its use? So one of the things that it does is that it exposes the pattern in some ways, because you could say that in a normal traditional world, things are just natural. Like people don't necessarily think about these questions. They just live them, right? It's like animals. Like animals don't ask themselves about the patterns that they inhabit. But when things start to go awry, things kind of start to go into extremes where you actually see extremely like difficult obtuse patterns up here, and then you kind of see idiosyncrasy down here. You're like, oh, wait a minute, like you can kind of see what's going on. And I think that scene can then be fed back into a more embodied world. And so that sounds abstract what I'm saying, but so I do believe that let's say the future will be an integration between embodied, kind of incarnate art with enough understanding about what modernism proposed to be able to integrate it in a way that doesn't call attention to itself completely. And so a good example, if you're interested, there's an iconographer. His name is Father Siluan Justiniano. I think he's one of the best icon painters in America. He was an abstract postmodern abstract painter in the 90s. And, he had all these scholarships in New York. He was doing great. Like he was on that path, and then he became a monk. So he began painting icons, and what he's been doing is integrating, let's say, extremely sophisticated color field theory, and let's say the principles that were developed by the abstract expressionists into his painting. And so the way in which, like in the 70s, the theories about color like that they came up with were crazy. About they went really deep into, so they would make these paintings that no one could ever care about, right? Just a bunch of squares, like a bunch of squares of color. But it was the theory that went behind it was an extremely sophisticated understanding of color relationships and vibration and how colors affect each other. And so it's like you can take that and put it back into something great. You can think the same about literature. It's like the modern writers, if you think of Beckett or you think of Joyce, their deep understanding, for example, of both like pattern and abstraction and also of idiosyncrasy at the same time, like that kind of relationship, that extreme relationship they're able to create can feed back, I think, into the modern world. So if you a good example of that, I don't know if you know, there's an author, his name is Paul Kingsnorth, and he does that. Like he writes something like Beckett meets Tolkien. I mean, it's crazy. He wrote a novel called Beast. It's an astounding novel, but he actually grammatically, he actually changes the grammar of the words so his character, as he's losing his mind, like the grammar of the sentences starts to break down in the story. So he uses modern tropes of actually playing with grammar and playing with punctuation. And this is like really avant-garde stuff, but he's ultimately telling a story that follows the mythological pattern. So I think there are ways to do it. I don't know in music. I'm afraid I don't know enough about music. That'll be you guys. People point to Arvo Pärt a bit. Like I know people point to Arvo Pärt as a possible solution to the conundrum, as someone who is integrating, avant-garde into a more kind of embodied and celebratory music. So
I think someone raised their hand.
Oh, someone's raised their hand.
That's me.
With Peter.
Do you believe that the art or music is created or is rather discovered? So if there is such thing as an objective deity, that I suppose it's derived from natural patterns. So then, would you say that it's more closely to be like discovered, like as if you were like, I don't know, as if a miner would.
Yeah. I know. I understand exactly what you mean.
And then second part. Then would you say that contemporary music, because it disregards for the beauty and the natural patterns, is as such more closely to be created because it's more of a random chance? Yeah.
So I would say to the first part of your question, I would say that it's both. I know it's boring as an answer. It's like I'm not going to answer, but I think that anybody who has an intuition, a real intuition, feels like they are not. Doesn't come from them. Like if you like when that happens, usually you're on the right track. At least in my case, like when I have an intuition and I feel like that intuition isn't from me, that like you said, I feel like it's like falling into me, or right, it's like I'm being assaulted by the idea, it's like it just seizes you, and then I think most of the time you feel like you're discovering, at least I do, but then there's also the implementation, and I think that in the implementation then you have more of this kind of giving birth, or this forming and this shaping, right? Because usually what you have as an insight doesn't have body. At least I don't know about you guys. I'm not a musician. Like I'm talking about my own experiences. So usually what comes to me as insight doesn't have body. It's like almost like it almost is like a relationship, right? A pattern, a relationship. And then when I put it into the world, then there's a shaping that comes. So I think that would be the way that I would, at least I would describe it, let's say, so an example, like I've been just for a while now, I've been wanting to like rewrite fairy tales, and the way that I want to do it is I want to get to the fairy tale. Like so for example, like I don't understand Jack and the Beanstalk. I never understood Jack and the Beanstalk since I was a kid. I was like, what is this story about? Like, why is this the hero? He's stealing from the giant. Like what? Why? So why? Like, what is happening in the story? And so it's like I've basically just been. That question has just been in my mind for 20 years. I mean, not more, 35 years or whatever, 40 years. And so, but recently I'm like, no, I need this. Like, I want to write a version of Jack and the Beanstalk. So I just left that there. And then I don't know how it works. I don't know how it works. At some point, I'm sitting there, I'm like, and all of a sudden it just like, it's like a lightning bolt, right? It just strikes you and you're like, oh, I get it. I know what that's about. Like, I know what that story is about. But then I have to write it. Like, I haven't written it yet, So in terms of contemporary music, like your second part of your answer, I think that this is what I see about contemporary music, is that I see that some contemporary music is actually hyper patterned. Like it isn't idiosyncratic. Some of it is like, I'm going to have this pattern and I'm going to shove it down your throat. Like, I'm going to just like make you listen to it, even though it's unbearable, but it's like, here's my idea. I have this idea. And it's like this idea that I'm just going to like just force into the world almost. And so I think there's a lot of that in contemporary art in general. And I think contemporary music, especially. And then there's also the other, exactly what you said. There's also the other part, which is just like this kind of like noise where, like, oh, like, yeah, I dropped this, whatever, like I hit the side of the bowl. And it's like, so you have you have this sense of like idiosyncratic sound as well. So that's what I see in both. And so I think there can be an excess of both. I really see the modern world as something like a move into excess. And if we try to understand it too much as one side, which is moving towards idiosyncrasy, and if we try to understand it too much as kind of authoritarian patterns that are imposed, then we miss one part of it. But if we see it just as like a radicalization of the two sides, which is like, which is the internet? Is the internet the freest, most chaotic space to ever existed? Or is the internet the most authoritarian space that has ever been thought up by man? It's like, it's just both at the same time. I don't know exactly how that is, but it's just both at the same time.
So the thing, like a sin of contemporary music is that it's too much of following patterns, or it's too much of not following the patterns. Which one do you think it is?
I really do think that it depends on the music. I think that so you think about two sins, right? Think about one sin, and both of them have to do with pride, right? The first sin is saying, I don't want to submit to any rules. I'm my own person. Nobody's going to tell me what to do, right? That's the first sin. The other sin is, oh, I'm going to make this happen. I don't care if the whole world resists me. Like, if all reality resists this thing that I want to do, I'm going to do it, and there's nothing you can do to stop me. And so, like, you can see they both come from the same source, but one manifests itself as an authoritarian desire to impose a pattern on something that can't hold it, or doesn't want to, or will just get crushed by it. And the other one is refusing all natural patterns and wanting to move away. So I think that it's just both at the same time.
Yeah, I just want to ask about you as a Christian iconographer and an artist. I know, correct me if I'm wrong, I understand in Orthodox tradition, icons, even in the Catholic tradition, icons are seen as a window into heaven, and each symbol of the hand or each color is seen as a very theological expression, and any changing or innovation of that could be even seen as heresy. So how do you as an artist kind of break those boundaries or innovate, express yourself, and how do you move forward with that art?
Yeah, so I think that some of what you said, I think, has been vastly exaggerated in terms of just how strict it is. And I think, and I understand why. It's like, I think that some people who felt like most contemporary art was just anything goes, and that there were no rule, rhyme, or reason, and no meaning, then looked back at medieval art and saw, wow, these things have patterns, these things have meaning, these things have a sense, and then they just want to hold on to that. But the reality of traditional iconography is that it is extremely variable. There's a lot of variation in styles, variation in tropes. Now, it's not an absolute variation. There are limits, and there are tropes. There are patterns that you have to follow in order for it to be recognized by the community in which you're trying to serve. And so that's probably the best way to understand it. It's almost like you could understand it like English has certain grammatical rules, and if I don't use those grammatical rules, then people won't recognize that it's English. And so if I make an image and I'm like, well, I want Jesus to have a pumpkin head. Well, I'm sorry to tell you that no one will recognize that as Jesus, and therefore it will be seen as heresy. And so there is a way in which we recognize something as belonging to the tradition, but you'd be surprised to what extent there's variation. And I think that the way that I see it is that innovation is neither good nor bad. Innovation is a neutral thing. Innovation has to serve a purpose. And when innovation serves a purpose, usually the strange thing that happens is people recognize it. People recognize it as being traditional, having been traditional the whole time. They have the feeling that they've seen it before, but they haven't. So it's like I've created images which absolutely never existed before in the church, but I've never had anybody complain, because the spirit in which I did it, the reason for which I've done it was in order to, with love towards the community. It's like, my purpose isn't to show you that I'm call attention to myself, show you that I'm better than you, that I'm smarter, that I've thought of this new thing that I want to kind of shove into your face. It's like, no, I want to serve this community. I want to participate. And so a good example would be, so for example, in the Orthodox Church, we have an image of the resurrection. So we have an image of Christ going into death and saving Adam and Eve, right? You see Christ holding Adam and Eve. He's pulling them out of death. And so then we also have the image of the crucifixion, of a cross. And so at some point I started making crosses that had that image on it. And I'd never seen that ever. And I don't think that actually exists, but no one ever said anything. It was totally fine. And so priests started wearing crosses with this image on it. And no priest in the history of the world had ever worn a priest with that image on it. But it was totally fine, because it's like I'm not putting a cat there, or I'm not putting Justin Bieber. I'm doing something which is like a poetic reformulation of something you already participate in, right? It's like oh wow, yeah, an image of the descent into death on the cross. Like, maybe they don't even think it, they just see it and it's like, yeah, that makes sense. So I think there's a lot of that where it's a lot of the problem that modern religious art has had is that it acts out of the sense of genius, like the sense of trying to keep up with the times. Like, it's not acting with the desire to integrate and to make something participate in the community. But if you do that, you'd be surprised at what you can do. You can actually do quite a bit.
I think it was Isaac Newton who always carried a Bible underneath his arm or something like this. Just like this idea of like constant serving his genius to something higher than him. Magnus in the chat asks a mystical question. He says, "Do you experience something under the symbolic layer, something ineffable, numinous, and hard to define, but something which can be experienced in the body in moments of silence and depth and be transformative?"
And so yes, I do believe in that. And so I think the best way to understand that is the source of the symbolic patterns. So you can understand that, let's say, at the core is something like a transcendent something which actually cannot be described, something that cannot be said, something that cannot be expressed, and you can access that. You can have access to those experiences where you all of a sudden feel transported into that space. But then what happens is that when it expresses itself, so as soon as it expresses itself, when you talk about it, when it comes back down into your art, or when it comes back down into the world, it actually will inhabit this kind of symbolic world. And so, yeah, so I do think so. And I think that you can actually, know the difference between someone who's had a true mystical experience and someone who's had a twisted mystical experience. Is that often the person who's had the mystical experiences comes back from that experience and wants to destroy the world. Like they're like, I experienced everything. I experienced like the mystical, ineffable root of being, and now nothing matters. Now all of this is trash. Like the whole world is just Maya. Like the whole world is just illusion, and none of these things mattered. All your religions, all your communities, all your things, they're all nothing, right? So you see it. Like if you listen to people, sometimes you'll hear exactly that tone. And to me, it's like, well, I think you're on the wrong side of the bed, because it's like if there is something ineffable behind phenomena, then it is the source of phenomena. So it should actually fill phenomena with this kind of unsaid, but not destroy it. Like, anyways, so that I tend to always keep that in mind when I listen to people who talk about that.
I'd love to get your thoughts on psychedelics. We talked yesterday. I know this is the thing. And this is something I really want to chat. Yesterday we talked with Carl Ruck, who's one of the authors of the Road to Eleusis and one of the experts on the Eleusinian mysteries. We were talking to him about the difference between, so in terms of altered states of consciousness and sort of mystical experiences and this kind of thing. We were comparing, say, playing a musical instrument to sort of achieve an altered state of consciousness requires a level of skill, dedication, discipline, practice, this kind of thing. But taking a psychedelic is very easy, and it does something to you, which people come back and say that was a mystical experience. Do you think that there is a fundamental difference between something like how would you say, genuine religious illumination or a mystical experience and the kind of experience that people describe coming back from psychedelic trances?
Yes, I do think so. I think very much so. I do think that it's like, for all the love of the people that I exchange with today, it's like everybody's talking about psychedelics, and just everybody talks about it. And I feel like it's misplaced, and I feel like it's dangerous. So a good example, the Eleusinian mysteries is actually a good example of this very problem, which is that, let's say the Eleusinian mysteries had a psychedelic in their ritual, right? And so people tend to think that that's true, and they tend to think they have proof of that. If the Eleusinian Mysteries had a psychedelic, the Eleusinian Mysteries lasted, I think, was it 3 days? 3 days of rituals and fasting and attention and maybe like sleeplessness and whatever it is that they did. It like a whole huge like ritual that lasted days and also lasted a millennia in time. And so if at the end of that, to like tip them over or whatever, they took some kind of substance, like, now why the hell is everybody just talking about that substance now? Now that's all people care about. It's like, what's the formula? What's the chemical formula? Like, what's the chemical, right? Because exactly that. Like we're materialists, and we think that's what transcendence is. It's like, you know, and so but I'm not saying it's complete. I've never taken psychedelics, right? So, but I have met people that have taken psychedelics and it transformed their life for the better. To be honest, I have met them. I've also met people who've taken psychedelics and that it turned them into psychos, like just turned them into complete psychos, and they lost their family, they lost their jobs, they've just lost it. And so, like whatever psychedelics are, if they rip the veil away or whatever, I think that, like you said, I think that the discipline of practice, whether it's prayer, whether it is music, whether it is, dance, whether it's all these different things, is far more integrated and far more useful for your life than just having like a tourist experience in the transcendent. It's like, here I am, some tourist walking through this world of spirits. Man, I don't know. It just, to me, like, it just sounds very dangerous. Also, because I have met people that have just completely lost their lives because of them.
Thank you very much. Winnie, did you have a question?
Yeah, I did. I will backtrack our conversation a little bit. So earlier when we were talking about modernism and also when you were talking about innovation, you sort of brought up twice in different ways. You sort of talked about this concept of having something new, whether it's caused by extreme visions or whether it's caused by just fresh ideas, and then sort of finding something that is more traditional and compatible with it, and then sort of marrying those two as sort of the middle ground. How do you identify what is compatible with what? Is there some sort of identifiable law or pattern behind that?
Yeah, I think there are. There are in the sense of the practicality. I think that's one of the reasons why I talked about this idea of like embodiment in a community. And so that is usually part of it. And so I think it's not easy, because it's like the opportunities to create embodied works of art right now are very far in between. It's not like something that we can do. It's not like a lot of people get commissioned to like write a piece of music to celebrate the anniversary of something or whatever. Like it's difficult for that to happen. But like usually that would have been part of the meat of the art, right? Part of the consistency of it would have been its integration into its purpose. So like, what is its purpose? So like, let's say I write a piece of music for a dance, is not the same that if I write a piece of music as a national anthem, right? If I write a piece of music in a church, it's not the same as if I write a lullaby for a child. Like those actually are recognized by people as participating in their world. So it's like, there's a part of it which is objective, which I think has an objective pattern. And so it's like lullabies usually aren't fast and fast tempoed. They're slow, and they have a kind of a way to modulate sound that is appropriate to their use. But then there's also the historical reality of what you live in, right? The world in which you live has certain traditions of sonority, certain traditions of space, certain traditions of images that you just kind of you just kind of continue and you participate in. Now, in terms of an actual pattern, usually the pattern is like a, you can understand it like a wave. You can understand it like a circumambulation, right? So you start at the center, you move out, and then you return to the center. Not exactly the center, maybe another point which is similar to it. That tends to be the pattern of pretty much everything. All stories tend to have that pattern. Images have that pattern in space, so they have a central focus, and then they'll have an edge or a margin, and then that edge or margin has characteristics, and the central focus has characteristics. And so that's the way that I would see it. In terms of music, I don't know, like I said, the technical aspect of it enough, but usually that's the way, that's the pattern. You can express it different ways. It can be a mountain, like a coming up or a coming down the mountain. It can be, like I said, it can just be this, like a serpent moving around an axis. So it's like a pattern that cycles and returns. It changes a bit and cycles and returns and changes a bit. So a mix of recognizability and difference, right? And so if you have enough of that, like, I mean, I think Bach is the best for that. Like a fugue is like almost like the perfect vision of that, right? It's like he gives you something, he states it, and then he's like, let me play with this. And he plays and he plays. And at some point you're like, where is this going? Like, I don't even know what's going on anymore. It's like, oh, and then all of a sudden you're like, wait a minute. No, I see it. It's coming. And then all of a sudden it comes not exactly maybe even the way you want it to. And it's like, that's like probably in terms of the way I would understand, like in terms of music, one of the best versions of that pattern.
Just coincidentally, next door, someone's playing the piano. They're playing a mystical piece by Scriabin. And it just made me think of something Scriabin wrote in his diary, because he was very interested in this sort of, similar to, you talk about like the Orthodox, the theody, this idea of like sort of becoming sort of united with God. But Scriabin writes in his diary, I am God. And this is something that I think could potentially be a problem with this sort of new understanding of religion as a sort of symbolic language that people will try and, like we were talking earlier about, like the modernists, like they try and create the music instead of discover it. In this way with religion, people are sort of, I worry that people will start to create religions out of this sort of symbolic substrate. Do you worry about the same thing? And how do you, just on top of that, like how do you then defend a religious belief without it being attached to something like a dogma?
Yeah. I mean, I see it happening. It's happening now. It's happening all the time. Like the religious is crashing back into our world, with speeds that are hard to deal with. And it's happening in ways that are very, that are kind of chaotic and kind of messy. So, we saw during COVID was an acceleration, like an accelerant of religious patterns. I mean, it was nuts in terms of watching, taboos get set up, and then, scapegoating, and then also George Floyd during COVID, it was crazy. It was like, it was a religious event. I mean, it was circumambulation and like, kind of ecstatic union after fasting. So think about it. It's like people had been like isolated in their houses for months, and then someone gets sacrificed, and then all of a sudden it's like, whoa. It's always like Dionysian in terms of what was going on during George Floyd. And so we're seeing it happen all around, and it's kind of it's scattered and it's messy. And so I think that we are definitely in danger of seeing, because religious patterns, it's like, religious patterns are super dangerous. Like they're so dangerous. So like most dogma and rules and taboos, like, thought out taboos and rituals are there in some ways to mediate the religious in the world, because it tends to burn like a fire, right? If it comes through, it's not, it can leave, if you read the Bacchae, you can see what religious patterns do. If people kind of let themselves go to that inebriation, it leads to sparagmos, right? It leads to ripping apart of the world. And And so I do think that we're definitely in danger of seeing that happen. And we have, I think COVID was really an example where we could kind of see a glimpse of what was possible in terms of a religiosity in a secular kind of technological world. And so I do think that dogma is actually a good thing to a certain extent. Like if dogma is understood in its proper place, right? And so, you know, for example, in Orthodox Christianity, we have a creed, we have a statement of faith, we have things that we believe, and we also understand that it's apophatic, which is that these are not positive statements. They are in some ways protective statements or negative statements to avoid us from becoming crazy, but ultimately the transcendent is beyond that. So God is beyond, like, it's like, you know, I'd say I definitely believe in the Holy Trinity, but I could also say God is not a Father or a Son or a Spirit. Like that is not heretical at all, like, because we know that these are kind of negative statements to help us understand. So I do think that dogma in religion is inevitable and necessary, because without it, it leads to like New Age insanity, right? It leads to like crystal, like just, you know, cults and gurus and like, you know, like neo-tantric in like madness that we've seen happen in the past, you know, 10, 20 years, which leads to really, I mean, it really destroys people. Like I know people that have been destroyed by neo-tantrism, like really like psychologically messed up. So I think so I do think that dogma is important, because or else we're in trouble. So sorry, I hope I'm not disappointing you guys too much with that.
Well, I come from a very religious country, from Sri Lanka, and the biggest religion is Buddhism, and there's Christianity and Islam, but there was always a respect for each other's religion. But as I came to England, especially to university, it could be because I lived in such a religious country, I saw so many forms of religion in university in the secular form, meaning, oh, here's a belief, for example, gender is a spectrum, you have to believe it. If not, you will be, you know, what in the older days is a heretic and these days a bigot or something like this. Or I see even there's this kind of negative view on white male, as if the white male is the worst thing to exist and all opportunities are given based on, you know, sex or based on color and not anymore on merit. So I feel that it wasn't the conversation I wasn't expecting coming to the West, but in the West, how do you think we can have just more conversation between different beliefs and just more respect for different beliefs?
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, because the religion, let's say the ascendant religion, you know, right now, I would say there are different versions, but that the woke kind of ascendant religion is definitely one. Like it's definitely one. It's part of it, because it has a kind of zeal, right? And right, it has that like fundamentalist zeal where you can't question. There's certain things you can't say. Like if you ask, even just ask questions about certain things, like there's a kind of, you know, fire, divine fire that just like rushes out of people. And so I think we're definitely in that world now. It's really a problem, because, you know, all religions will exclude, like all religions will have dark skeletons in their closet, but the way religions are set up is not arbitrary. And so they actually there's a reason why they're set up the way they are. And so, for example, if you take, I mean, I'm a Christian, so obviously I understand Christianity better. You know, the notion of of Christ, for example, the notion of the crucifixion, right, is in some ways a way to safeguard against the things we're seeing now, which is that it's like I see myself as the one who crucified Christ, for example, right? I see in the one that is beaten and rejected and refused, I see in them an image of God. And then I try not to do that, let's say. But now we have this, it's like a weird, the modern one, it's like almost like a weird parody of Christianity, where, you know, Christianity has always had a deep compassion for victims and a deep desire to love the oppressed and the marginalized. But now it's like being weaponized, where it's like, let's flip it upside down, where now the marginalized and the oppressed, you know, have the right to demand of other people this, have the right to, let's say, exclude the others. And so we're returning to more of like an ancient, like, religion of purity, like almost like a yeah, in the Jewish temple, for example, in the Hebrew temple, you know, strangers weren't allowed in to the temple at all. Like, they weren't allowed to come in. And so it's like we're returning to that type of behavior. So yeah, hopefully, I mean, we all hope that it'll just kind of play out without too much violence, I guess, because in some ways it can't, I don't think it can sustain itself, that type of thinking on the long term. But yeah, we're in a strange situation, that's for sure. But actually the solution, I think, though, the solution, and this has been the solution that I've been proning, is to help people understand the function of the margin and the exception and the strange. And so, you know, I talk about monsters a lot. I talk about margins, and I talk about idiosyncrasy. And it's like, you know, I talk about carnival in a lot of my talks about the function of carnival in a traditional society. And so I think that, because what happens is that the right, or the conservatives, or whatever, the people reacting to this woke thing, I mean, they just go full on too. And so you just create these two opposites that just can't talk to each other. It's horrible. And I think the best way would be to help people understand the role of the strange, but then also understand that it's strange for a reason. It's like, you know, the margins are marginal, and the marginal has a function in the world, and that function has positive and negative aspects to it. And it's like, if you want the positive aspects of the margins, you kind of have to live with the negative aspects of the margin. If you want the positive aspects of the center, you have to live with the negative aspects of them. So you can't have it all. Like, you can't be a margin and a tyrant at the same time. That leads to absolute madness. So we need to find the proper balance. So
thank you. First question first. Just as an Orthodox Christian, you were saying dogma has its place. Do you think then that right action, or orthopraxy, requires orthodoxy?
I think so. I mean, I think they go together for sure, because, you know, especially in orthodoxy, in other types of Christianity, maybe not so much. Like in orthodoxy, it really is the liturgy, you know. And so for example, like, we sing the creed during liturgy. We don't just abstractly think it, we sing it together. And so as we sing it together, we're manifesting our unity. And so that's actually moving us towards communion. That's why, you know, in the creed, for example, its place in the liturgy is moving now, because there's the first part of the liturgy, which used to be for kind of everybody. And then there's the second part of the liturgy, which used to be just for the people that are baptized. And so the second part of the liturgy is like this like compression moving towards the meal, where we all share the same, you know, the same sacred meal. And I think that we have to understand that the orthodoxy and the orthopraxy, they just go like that, because it's a celebration of what we have in common, both in practice, you know, and in love of one another, but also in mind to a certain extent, and then kind of moving towards the communion chalice. So yeah, I think you need both.
Really?
What is your opinion on the current movement of spirituality without religion? Do you think those two things are separable?
No, I don't think they're separable. And the reason why is, you know, we talked about this fractal pattern. You know, we talked about how the patterns of the world, they kind of exist at different scales. And one of the problems with the like spiritual but not religious is that the spiritual but not religious person says, I don't want this spiritual pattern to bind me to others. I just want it to be my own individual thing. And so the only way for it to bind you to others is through common something. That's how you're bound to others. You're bound to others through common action, through common attention, through common singing, through common movement. And so that's religion. I don't know what to tell you. And so if we stand together, if we sing together, if we process together, if we bow together, if we do the things that we do together, then the spiritual is not just binding me as an individual, but it's binding me to my family and my family to a larger communion, et cetera, et cetera. And so the spiritual but not religious is just another version of modernism, because it doesn't like the fractal relationship. It wants to reduce to the individual. It's like, I want to be an individual in relationship to the transcendent, complete transcendent, right? And see that that extreme that I mentioned. It's like, I want like the absolute transcendent, like, non-being of nirvana, and I just want it me. I don't want it to bind me to others. Like, I just want it to be me. And so I don't think, I mean, it's better. Like, I'd prefer spiritual but not religious to, I don't know, to someone who goes dancing at the club every day. Like, it's like I prefer someone who has spiritual practice, even if they're idiosyncratic and personal, rather than someone who drinks, gin all night. Like, it's like there's a hierarchy of things, but I do believe that true spirituality will have religion attached to it, because it's a binding agent.
In a way, it's the same answer as you gave before. It comes from pride, isn't it?
Yes.
Spiritual without religion, in a way, is like wanting to keep the meaning without accepting the truth.
Yeah, and
right?
without having to submit to authority. A lot of it's that too. It's like, well, I don't want to submit to any authority. I just want to have my own experiences, and it's like I want to have my own thing. But that's just not how the world works. What happens actually, and I know it sounds weird. It's like, what happens is the opposite. It's like, you're going to end up submitting to authorities that have never existed before. We're going to end up submitting to levels of authority that have never existed in the history of the world. Like, we're moving towards like weird authoritarian systems that are going to be total. And it's like, it goes together. Like the extreme, I always say, it's like a punk rocker can only exist in a world that is completely buffered and completely controlled and completely maintained on a schedule. Because if you put a punk rocker in the Amazonian jungle, like, they'll die in 1 day, 2 days, because they're not bound. Like, so you need these extreme systems of like control. And so if you try to move towards idiosyncrasy and you're like, I just want me, my spiritual thing, my own thing, like, I'm just gonna take a hodgepodge, do whatever I want. It's like you're creating that rift. And it's going up too. It's gonna create, systems of control. I know it sounds weird. It sounds like it's a contradiction, but if you think about modernism that way, it actually will solve a lot of problems for why modernism happened the way it did. Because that's what it looks like.
If dogma is necessary for a relationship with the transcendent, how then do we avoid the dark side of dogma?
I mean, saints, I don't know what to tell you. It's like, you need developing your own life instead of focusing on others. Like, I think that's probably the best. It's like loving others, and then seeing sin in myself. I mean, that's for sure. Like, I'm talking way more from a Christian perspective. I'm sorry, but it's like, I think that from a Christian perspective, there's a joke about how Protestants think that no one's going to heaven except for me, right, or except for my gang. And there's a joke in Orthodoxy, which is that everybody's going to heaven except me. And it's like, that's probably the best approach, right? is to see your own sin and to always focus on your own lack, and then you probably will be able to avoid the problems of dogma if you do that.
Brilliant.
Can I just sorry.
Sorry, it's just like with the last thing you just said, then how do you avoid the psychological problems with that?
What do you mean?
Just I guess the association that like everyone is going but me.
Yeah, it's mostly a mental state where you're just trying to not see yourself as higher than others, you know. And so we obviously, you also you wouldn't, if in that state you're self-flagellating, then that's pride too, by the way. It's like self-flagellation is pride, you know. Most people that are like, because you think you're so important, right? You think you're that important that you should flog yourself. But I think that just this sense of like attending to your own thoughts and attending to your own and not thinking that you should be better than you are. Because a lot of the psychological problems that we have is that we think that we should be better than we are. So it's not that we actually think we're wretched. Is that we think we're wretched, but we think we should be awesome, like we should be heroes, but we notice we're actually wretched. I think that that's the problem. But if you just kind of see your own sins and you're like, okay, I mean, in a Christian perspective, you just see your own sins, and you're like, yeah, you know, just give it up. Like, I don't know, like when we confess our sins in Orthodoxy, we confess our sins like it's like we're sinning constantly. So we always say for all the sins, you know, that known and unknown, like I don't even know that I'm sinning. Like I'm just sinning all the time. And so if you're in that state where it's like you actually think that you're just sinning constantly, so much that you don't even know how much you're sinning. It's like, and you know, it's like, is there even room to self-flagellate? You know, it's like that's how it is. And so all you do is you kind of just give up and you just, you know, yeah. So I hope that, but it's like, by the way, I don't do that because I'm not a saint. So I've got a lot of pride. Don't worry. Like I hope, you know, I'm a hypocrite. Like that's for sure. I just hope that's clear.
No, I guess it's a question to both of you because you seem to be in agreement. You were talking about the problems of dogma or the dark side of dogma, and I wonder if you could elaborate on what this is.
No, but the dark side of dogma is that it gives you an insight to judge other people. That's what it is. It's like as soon as you have something which binds you, and it's not just dogma, it's the problem of any unity. So as soon as you have something that binds you together, as soon as you have any group, anything that you see that you have in common with others and binds you, that immediately creates an outside. There's no way around it. You can't have it all, right? It's like, I know that a lot of the like weird postmodern move is to just try to integrate everything into everything, but that doesn't work. It destroys the world. So you could say, so you could see it in all kinds of things, right? If you think of a sports team, right? If a sports team will have things that bind them together, and then they will have adversaries that are outside them that they're fighting. And so that's part of any type of unity. Now, the problem with religion is that it does that too. It does it in the absolute, because it's like I have access to God through this. And so now it gives me ultimate weapon to judge other people if I let myself go to that. So that's the danger of dogma. And I think that we have the tools. You know, I think for sure within Christianity, we have the tools to fight that. And I think part of the nature of Christianity is to avoid that problem in the image of Christ himself and the Sermon on the Mount and all these aspects. But that's definitely an issue. And, you know, if you'll catch yourself doing it all the time.
Thank you.
And so I think it's come up a lot tonight that pride is kind of sort of behind a lot of the sources of, I don't know, many problems, to say the least. So what's your antidote to pride?
I mean, I think I just formulated it, right? I think it's to try to see your own lacks first, right? To try to see what you're missing yourself, and to practicing humility in the sense that, you know, if you see like an easy trick to do, and it's like when I'm in my best moments I can do this, but it's not often, but like usually you catch yourself thinking something, right? You know, you look at someone and you catch yourself kind of judging them, or you know, whatever, or even if you're in a relationship, you catch you judge your partner, and I think it's like the discipline of right away asking yourself, it's like, could I say the same thing about me? Right. And so it's like, you know, someone lies and you're like, yeah, they're lying. It's like, yeah, do I lie? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I'm not saying, it's like, I'm not saying that this, let's say the thing that's happening to me, or let's say someone's doing something to you. It's like, it doesn't justify it. It doesn't mean you'll justify it, but it's like, have I been crappy to others? Right. You know, have I lost my temper? So it's like, so just kind of remembering yourself in a way so then what it does is it kind of mediates, I think, the issue. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't mean you should accept everything. I don't think so, unless you're really like a monk or something. But I think that just the discipline of always asking yourself, what aspect of what bothers me? Because often the worst part of it is that sometimes when something bothers you with someone, it's usually because you've got a little seed of that yourself, right? And so it's like, well, that person's really cocky. It's like, really, why are you noticing that? You know? Like you might have a little bit of that yourself, and that's why you're noticing it. And so, yeah, so I would say that that's probably the best way to go about that.
I think Jonathan gave a solution earlier as well, as he was talking about sin and catching yourself sin all the time. And then, you know, when you see you're sinning all the time, you just kind of give up. And that's also surrendering to your higher power is also a big antidote.
I guess what's not quite making sense to me is that this, at the end of the day, still sounds psychologically detrimental because it's still referrals, like self-referential, like in all the examples that you have given.
So maybe I could take the same thing that I said, but now flip it the other way, which is that what if every time you come in the morning and then there's someone who's impatient or there's someone who's annoying or whatever, then maybe try to notice something about them that is positive. Do it that way. Do it the other way if you don't like the seed on yourself. Like just try to remember that person is a human being that has a life and experiences, and that, you know, that so if it's hard for you to see how you're the same in terms of the negative part, you can maybe rather try to see the mirror, you know, the mirror of the good in the other person. I mean, I'm not saying that it's always possible, but I would say that might be a better, maybe another way to do something similar. That would be also kind of humility.
Could I add just one thing that Peter Graves, I'm sure maybe you've talked to him personally, I don't know. But Peter Graves really showed in an interview or a book, I don't remember, that humility is an arrow that points outwards, whereas pride is an arrow that points inwards. And so I think it's in this sense that the over-judging ourselves and over-criticizing in this posture of I'm so bad, it's really me.
Yeah.
So to put it very simply, humility is whatever points outwards, and pride is what.
I remember hearing the Dalai Lama actually say that someone asked him about people who are shy, and he said that's pride.
Yeah.
It's like it's pride because you're too self-conscious. You're thinking about yourself way too much, right? It's like you think you're so important that people are looking at you. Like you think people are like concerned with you and your presentation and all these things, and like that's what makes you shy. It's interesting. I mean, I don't know if it's completely true, but I just thought it interesting that he totally like switched it in terms of the way we think of it now.
So mention because like when you mentioned the pride and then antidote and then humility, it instantly reminded me of there's a cartoon called Avatar: The Last Airbender. And there was a quote in there like with a arrow basically saying, and I'm paraphrasing, pride is not the opposite of shame, but its source. The only true humility is the only antidote to pride. So it's interesting how it's basically exactly what we just yeah.
I think something could be said about beauty for that as well, because true beauty is always taking you out of yourself, isn't it? And what you were saying earlier about modernism is that it's just inward and not pointing to something outward.
Yeah, like
Yeah, well, there's definitely an aspect of modernism that's like a kind of radical, you know, a radical subjectivity, you know, and so it's like you go to a museum and some artist has their whole thing, like they just have, you know, they probably wrote books and books about the thing they're doing, and then you walk up to it and it's just, I don't know, it's like strands of hair hung from the ceiling, right? And it's like, yeah, this person spent like 20 years working on this project, and it's like, and then it's like, wait, so really I should care? Like I should care enough about your little idiosyncratic world to like dive in and like discover all the references that you're, it's like, I'm sorry, I just don't have the energy for it. And also, like, really, are you gonna subject me to that? Like your own little idiosyncratic world? I don't know. I'm not interested.
Yeah, then along that line, like if everything it points outwards, like to me that sounds a lot like compassion, right? In a sense that everything should sort of
Yeah, there you go. It's good.
And it, for us as musicians, then do you think that how do we, I guess, be compassionate performers? Are we in service to our audiences? Is that compassion?
I would hope so. I mean, I would. Yeah, I mean, I think that you have to be careful. Like when you say service to your audience, of course there's a balance. I think there's a balance because also you're trying to, like, let's say you make a piece of art. So on the one hand, you are trying to let's say reach out, to have compassion for your audience, but there's also a way in which you're also trying to kind of take them by the hand and kind of pull them into something. There is both. There's like both, you know, you can find, I think, a nice middle ground because I think that modern pop composition is like, it's like the worst of trying to please the audience because they're just like, what can I get people to click on? And then, it's just like things, songs appear and then vanish, within a few months, but it has to do with that problem of like trying to like really hit what people want right now, and just kind of give them what they want. But I think that true art is not like that. Like there's a balance between, let's say, kind of teasing. How can I say this? I mean, you think about it really like a meal, right? It's like, so I'm offering something of sustenance to the person, but then I will have spice in it in order to make it attractive and make it taste good. But there also has to be like substance to it,
So an element of you inputting parts of yourself to.
Well, that's going to happen inevitably. I tend to think people shouldn't put too much effort into that. Like, but I mean, that's like the opposite of contemporary thinking. It's mostly in service of something, I hope, like in service of something higher, right? In service of some, so it's like, for example, if you say, I mean, I'm just thinking out loud here because it's difficult for music now, like I said, but if you, let's say, like, I want to bring joy to people. Like I want people to experience longing. Like I want them to kind of move into that experience of longing and have a sense of that. And so it's like you're serving a higher purpose. You're basically like training people to have these experiences and these subtle experiences. And so you want to do it in a way that they'll recognize what you're doing, that they're seeing they see the breadcrumbs, right? Or they can get the little breadcrumbs as they're moving into what you're doing. And then once they're there, then you can kind of take them on a trip I just want you to know I have a meeting at 3, so I have like about 7 seconds.
I just wanted to say, just on top of what we were just talking about, which was such a beautiful part of the conversation, it echoed very closely what we were talking about with John Vervaeke, which was this idea that love is the opposite of addiction. And so there's this idea of pride being something that's inward and humility being something that's outward. John Vervaeke was saying that addiction is something that is reciprocally narrowing, and narrowing it sort of like thing where your framing comes increasingly closer and closer. But the opposite of that is reciprocal opening, and he calls that what love is. And I think that's a beautiful line of agreement with you and John.
Yeah, definitely. I think on that case, we really agree. I really recently I've been using Dante a lot as an image of that. And I think that for art, it's probably a good image to understand, let's say, what Dante was trying to do in the Commedia, which is exactly that. It has to do with your question about, so you could understand that, let's say I make a piece of art and I do it in service of a higher good, right? In the celebration of God, the celebration of love, or the celebration of something beautiful. But then I understand that, like, that people don't have access to that. And so what I do is I engage lower loves, right, in order to draw people in to this higher celebration. And so, so then you can use, let's say, you almost like seduce people into the experience. So you use tropes that people recognize, or you surprise them, or you do different things, but their purpose is actually just to draw them up into something more. And you see in Dante, you see that because it's something like he starts with poetry, right? He starts with Virgil. It's like Virgil is that lower love, these structure, these artistic patterns that we use in order to create our works, right? That's what Virgil is. That's what Virgil represents. And so it's like the craft, the techniques, all these things that we have, there's nothing wrong with them, especially we have to think about that, especially in the modern world, because people have seen these techniques and this craft as being factitious, as being like tricks and things that you shouldn't use because, they're cliche or whatever. But if they're in service of a higher good, then all of a sudden they find their purpose. And so you can use these techniques in order to draw people into higher loves. And so, Dante moves from Virgil to Beatrice, which is a woman that awoke love in him when he was a young person. Then he moves up towards saints, ultimately towards God himself. And so it's like these embedded loves is a good way to understand it. But you can also understand that in art, which is that, because I remember a friend of mine who's a contemporary painter that I love very much. At some point, he was basically saying, like, why are you doing this? Like the icon thing, like, why are you doing this stuff? It's all done. It's all been done, right? It's all these tricks and tropes and images that have all been done. And it's like, I can do it because I'm making an image for someone's baptism. But I can do it because I'm making an image to go into a church. Like, I have a reason. That's an actual reason. Like, that this object will enter into a community, will participate in the life of a church, of a family, or whatever. And so the lower loves, these lower aspects, these techniques, the way the lines work, or the way, using a halo and all these things are in service of a higher participation. And so there's no shame in using them, right? I'm not pretending that they are new or innovative or whatever. It doesn't matter.
Beautiful. I think that would be a really lovely place to end, especially because you've got something coming up. But thank you so much. It's been an amazing chat. Yeah.